for this amazing book and to support Dr. Walling. We do try to host a lot of events here in the store. If you aren't familiar, we try to host at least once a week, usually on a Thursday. But you can check out, we have a whole bookshelf over in the cafe with all of the books from our authors that are coming soon. We have a lot coming in September, so be sure to check that out. You can see that on our website as well. But I do want to get us started. I'm going to introduce Dr. Walling. She is a 1971 graduate of the University of St. Andrews School of Medicine in Scotland. Following rotating internships in Dundee teaching hospitals and specialist training in London, she joined the University of Kansas School of Medicine in 1981. She is a family physician with special interest in care of the elderly, and she taught Kansas medical students and assisted faculty with career development for over 30 years. So let's all give her a warm welcome.
I was not expecting so many people. And I want to give a special welcome to a few ladies here who were in the book or graduated during this time period. They're our heroines and the reason we wrote the book, and I'm not going to embarrass them anymore. And I also want to say thank you to the men who turned up. So apart from saying please buy my book, I want to say that this book started when I came here in 1980 from Scotland, so I'm still working on my Kansas accent. Rick Kellerman used to say I was bilingual because I can say Kansas. But there weren't very many women my age in medicine. There were a few of us hanging about, but I kept wondering where this missing generation was. And one thing led to another, and we got older and we did our thing. And at one stage, I was working for the medical school, and we wanted to look at problems that older women doctors were having, especially with having to care for elderly parents. And all the regulations allowed you to take time off to care for babies, but not to care for anyone else. So we had a meeting, and we gathered all the ladies over 60s and started saying, what are your problems? And they were a feisty group. They wouldn't stop telling stories. They wouldn't tell me about problems or new strategies that the med school could put into place. They kept telling stories about being in medicine and the ridiculous things that had happened to them. And then one of them, who is here, but I won't embarrass her, said there was an awful lot of terrible things that happened, things that were unfair and cruel and shouldn't have happened, but I had a lot of fun along the way. So we got the impression from our students were coming up to us and saying, oh, you were so brave. Oh, you put up with so much abuse. And we're kind of going, yeah, yes, we are, yes. And this lady said, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but, you know, I did have a lot of abuse and a lot of discrimination stuff, but there was a lot of meaningful work, there was a lot of good stuff, and there was a lot of fun. So we felt like the whole history of our generation was being told from a negative perspective, all the Me Too stuff. We're not denying the Me Too stuff or the unfair, nasty stuff that happened, but we wanted to tell the whole thing. Each lady I talked to had over 50 years of service and long careers. They felt they'd had meaningful lives of good work. So we got with the Alumni Association at KU, and they requested volunteers. And we asked people who'd graduated before 75 if they were willing to be interviewed. So let's just do a pop quiz to keep you on your toes. What do you think the percentage of women was in the class in 64? 2. Somebody gets a coconut. 2%. And then every year up until about 73, 74, it was less than 8%. So in a class of 100, there's a few girls. And that's kind of nice. They're there, they show that we're up to date and they can keep in their lane and be decorative. And then after 75, women began to come into the class in bigger numbers, and it got to 20% in 75. Probably because Title IX and other things had happened, especially that NIH and all the funding people required the universities, if they wanted federal grants, to have a certain proportion of minorities. So we got in. So I talked to 37 ladies over Zoom. We had standard questions. We did it as a proper qualitative research study, so I had a couple of PhDs helping, and they kept it all very kosher. And then COVID hit. So I was in Hawaii, actually, on the Zoom, talking to people all over the country, and each talked for about 2 hours answering questions. And we asked them, very general questions. Why did you go into medicine? What happened at school? What happened in college? What happened in residency? And it's really, we wanted to find out, why on earth would you go into medicine after the war up until the 70s, when everything was about guys? And it was actually really quite difficult. Your parents would be criticized for having an uppity girl going into medicine, and it was really quite a challenging thing to do. So the oldest lady I talked to graduated in 1948. And she was in a nursing home in Appalachia, little skinny lady with a bright red wig on. And I'm shouting questions into the laptop, and the social worker shouting the question to her, and she's yelling away. And once we got her started, we couldn't shut her up. So we said, why do you go into medicine? And she said, well, it was a hot day in 1934. I was 10 years old, standing outside my dad's office, and my dad was out delivering a baby, and this boy was brought in with gunshot wounds to the abdomen and the thighs. They'd been shooting rabbits and missed, and he looked like a rabbit. So she said my mum did what she could to patch him up, but they just threw him in a truck and went off in a cloud of dust. In 1934, it would be a cloud of dust, to Wichita. She said, I just thought if I had been a doctor, or Mum had been a doctor, we could have fixed him up here. So she decided in 1934, age 10, she was going to be a doctor. Yeah. So she got to KU in 1941, little, very pretty lady by the pictures we had. And she trotted up and said, pre-med. And they said, oh, don't worry, dear, girls don't do pre-med. And she said, I thought for a minute, and I just smiled and said, what classes are they? And they told me, and I did them. And she was still hugging herself. And this was kind of a theme, that the ladies I talked to hit problems, but instead of getting mad and suing someone and getting all irate about it, they navigated. They often used their charm, they certainly used their wits, but whenever they hit a barrier, they navigated. Well, most of them came from Kansas. About 25% of them came from farms, and half of them came from the bigger towns, the Wichitas, Topeka's, Kansas Cities, and the rest came from the middle-sized towns. And they tended to come from families that were not very well off. There was one very well-off lady. The rest were kind of frugal, good Kansas families. And we kept hearing these themes. They kept describing their parents as children of the Depression. And this thing about suffering and the Depression and making your own way and being responsible, and education, education, education. Of course, their parents had gone through the war, and there were stories about mums being Rosie the Riveter, dads using the GI Bill to bring the family up. But the families were huge on education. And another theme was, they kept telling us, be all you can be. And then they said, medicine? I think they said we wanted us to go as far as we could, but not quite that far. So they were very good at school, very, very good academically. They loved science and math, and they loved people. They were curious about people, and they wanted to help people. Those were the big motivations. So much to our surprise, they talked about not having much trouble getting science courses in college. We were expecting them to have been discouraged in college, but they said, no, they didn't really get discouraged. Occasionally they had a good role model or someone who helped, but mostly they were on their own. And then they got to admissions. And I see the lady doctors in the crowd shuddering. So the admissions procedure at KU in those days was really bizarre. 3 students went into a room where there were 3 professors, and they all interviewed simultaneously. I'm looking for validation. She's still shuddering. So the questions would come swinging at you, and you're kind of trying to look smart and dedicated and not too feminine, but to hold your own against the other guys. So there were some good stories from admissions, but every single person was asked about, are you really wanting to be a physician? You're going to get married and have children, are you? One lady was asked, what would you do if your husband didn't want you to work? And she said, well, I think I would know him better than that before I married him. Another lady was, she said the psychiatrist threw a question at her, what's your favorite TV program? And she had young kids, and she said, Mr. Rogers. And he burst out laughing. So there were lots of stories from admissions. The general assumption in those days was that women were twice as likely to drop out of medical school, and if they went into practice, they were going to be 1/3 to 40% less productive. So there was a real feeling that it was a waste of time. In a time of physician shortage, it was absolutely unpatriotic to train women. So going on with the story, they got into medical school. KU and all the other medical schools had graciously admitted women, but they hadn't thought it through. They just kind of, you got in, shut up, get on with it. So we had lots of stories about lack of accommodations. Students in those days had to do a lot of night call, night work. There was nowhere for the girls to sleep, except in the room with the guys, or on a gurney in the hall, or on a couch somewhere. So there was nowhere to sleep. They had to wear a uniform. I think it was Connie gave me the stories about the uniform. A little jacket and a straight white skirt to your knees, none of this stuff, but it was a straight white skirt. So medical students are very active. They're moving over beds, they're bending down. Lots of stories about trying to keep your tail up. And one year, a very resolute mother had had enough about this, and she stormed into the dean's office with a pair of culottes. You know what culottes are? You can tell the men later. And she said, my daughter is not going to have people looking up her ears. And she said she made 7 pairs of culottes for all the girls in the class. The dean apparently said, as long as they're not pants, they can wear them. So that was some of the stuff that they had to deal with. They weren't sure whether KU was trying to discourage them or just hadn't thought that women might be different from men. And I'm kind of blanking, there's so many stories about things. Medical school was also very different in those days. Those of us in my generation, I was in Scotland, which was a bit even worse. We're still having post-traumatic stress from our medical education. The chiefs on the units were absolute gods. Am I telling the truth? The chief medical attending could make you or break you at will. And the students were working very, very hard, and they were taught by what's called pimping. So everyone gets around the bed, and Barbara's just shuddering. And questions are fired about the patient. And you keep going until you can go no longer, and then you're humiliated in front of everybody. We were taught by humiliation, unless you were really lucky and got a great teacher. So it was pretty tough to keep your head up and keep going. The other thing was that they were all kind of short of money, and they're trying to find a decent, affordable place near the med center, which was interesting, and trying to eat and get places and sleep, and maybe have a boyfriend or two on the side, but there was not a lot of talk about romances during med school. So they managed to do pretty well. There are lots of stories, I can't tell them all. After med school, you have residency. And one thing that's really different now is in those days you basically spoke to the residency director and asked for a job. Please, may I have a job? Whereas now you have this big complicated process. So they got into residency, and to our surprise, most people said they got the residencies they wanted, and even spoke fondly of some of the faculty at KU reaching out to help them get residencies in other places. Is Martha here? Can I tell you a residency story? So some of the ladies by this time are married to other doctors who are in the military, and they don't know where they're going. And I think you were expecting to go to San Diego, and you got Norfolk Broad?
Yes.
So Martha, to her great credit, is suddenly having to find a residency on the other side of the country. You want to tell them what happened?
Well, I wrote letters to all of the schools that were within 200 miles because my husband was only able to be 200 miles away from his post in Norfolk, Virginia in the Navy. So I wrote letters and got letters back that they had no space because I had 3 months to find the residency that I wanted. And then I got a call from Johns Hopkins and said, I have an opening for you, but your husband will be in Norfolk, Virginia, and you'll be in Baltimore, and I will only take you if you will be a 7-day-a-week resident and not a 5-day-a-week resident, 2-day-a-week housewife. So I did it. And so I lived in Baltimore, and then my husband finished and spent I wound up there in Baltimore 4 years, then had to decide, do I come back to Wichita? And this neighborhood where this used to be Gessler's drugstore, because I went to Robinson and East High, or are we staying, I was on the faculty at Johns Hopkins. But my husband was in research and radiology, and I was a clinician teacher. So many of us were women, and I knew that I would not advance if I stayed there academically. Women were not, they said, oh, you're lucky, by the 70s now at least you're getting paid, even though I was paid a lot less than the men. So we came back to Wichita and have been very happily here ever since.
Great, thanks, Matt. Some of the stories I forgot were that these ladies, like many of you, were in college during the 70s, and it was kind of interesting. And there were stories about the bombs and the burnings on KU campus. And the class of 72, they had their graduation cancelled because of the fires and the riots. So one lady I spoke to said, yes, we had our graduation cancelled in 72, but they're doing a great makeup 50 in 22. And then I called her back when we'd done the interview, so she said, we got cancelled again because of COVID. I still haven't got done. I'm told that class did manage to walk down the hill eventually. So when we got through, residency was brutal. And in those days, residents really pretty well lived in the hospital. And by this time, several people had small children, and a few gallant ladies were single mothers. So you're trying to have babies and be a resident, and you get the picture. And I had stories about ladies being called into the hospital in the middle of the night and taking the baby and just asking the nurses to hide it somewhere. Or putting the children into the call room and telling them to be very quiet. And one lovely lady who was doing anesthetics at KU, she had her patients were asleep and she was managing the babysitter, the overnight babysitter, because you had to have 3 or 4 babysitters, called and said she had a family emergency, she had to leave. So our gallant lady doctor got someone else to cover the patients. There were no cell phones and things in those days. She had to dial around and find another babysitter, clear across town, get in her car, race up, drop the baby door. You get it. She's racing back, and of course she gets stopped for speeding. And she said, I just burst into tears. And the cop said, lady, you got problems. And he gave her an escort into the medical center. There are so many stories like that, but these stories that could have been terrible were being told to me with a laugh and a smile. And that included the stories about inappropriate touching, about not being considered for a fellowship, about being second class, and some ladies said, you just took the job that you could, and you knocked it out the park, and then you took the next job. And what this generation did was build credibility. They just went to the office and did the job, and then it gradually became, okay, she's a good colleague, she's a good doctor. And so being a woman doctor was not this odd thing, this weird thing. They built the credibility for women to be doctors. But they didn't have an easy time when they went into practice. They thought, I've done it, I got through medical school, I've got through residency, I'm still standing. Going into practice was a completely different world. There were some very hard to hear stories about not being offered a job, not being accepted into a partnership, having to struggle for years and years and years to get a partnership or equipment, whereas the man coming in immediately gets into the boys' club and gets accepted and gets referred patients and gets covered for call. There was a lot of real struggle. Just when you thought you'd done it all, you hit this wall in practice. But they kept going, and they gradually made their way through. They did say that the guys they trained with were there was a sort of generation shift in physicians as they went through. But many of them said when they first went into practice, the practice or the boss on the academic unit said, look at us, look how modern we are, we have a woman. But they went from sort of being token women or being handmaidens who did all the work and got none of the glory to being credible colleagues. And that's the story of this generation. So it's hard to put it all together, 38 ladies over 50 years of practice. But we asked them to talk freely about what happened, and then we said, what's the best thing about practice? What's the worst thing? What would you do over? And when I said, what's the best thing, they just started. And it was always about the patients, and then the intellectual stimulation, the joy of working with colleagues. So this combination, just as when they were little girls, it was a combination of the science and the people. And they felt they'd had meaningful lives full of good work, they'd made a difference, they'd fulfilled their brain, they'd had a good time. It was tough, but they'd done it. And I said, what about what's the worst thing about practice? And there was kind of a silence for a little while. And then they said what all doctors say, the paperwork, the administration, the medical record. But, so I'm going to wrap it up because Lynn's waving at me. This is a book about a generation of women, 38 of them. The other books about women doctors tend to be about the few great heroines, and I wanted to talk about the daily experience of our generation. And it was tough. And one lady said, that's why we went into it. We're the kind of people who, if you tell us not to do something, we'll do it. But they wanted to care for people, they wanted to have meaningful lives, they wanted to use their brains and their brawn. They didn't realize they were going to have to use their brawn, but they did. And they made a difference. And there was a lot of discrimination. There's a whole chapter about the gender thing. But we don't want to be regarded only as the survivors of the Generation Me Too thing. We want to be regarded as just like you, baby boomers, and before, a generation who have made a difference. So that now it's not uncommon to see a woman surgeon, a woman physician, and you expect great medical care from them. So I want to pay tribute to ladies in the audience who are in this generation and made a big difference and made it possible for the girls now to be taken seriously as physicians. So please buy the book.
Yeah, so we're going to do some questions from the audience. If anyone has any, just raise a hand. Oh, we're going to start right here.
Family physicians, or how many went on to become specialists?
Actually, there was only one family physician. The biggest group, I should have said this, the biggest group in our were in the KU ladies who graduated were internists, followed by pediatricians. Now, when they went up to medical school, they said it was assumed they were going to be pediatricians. And it's actually in the literature that girls were told they could do the 3 Ps: pediatrics, pathology, and psychiatry. And pediatrics was what women did. Psychiatry if you're a bit weird, and pathology if you didn't like people. So that was in the literature, but our group were predominantly internists, a lot of psychiatrists. But I'm wondering, and those who went to KU can tell me, if the internists was because of the very dominant personalities, the internal medicine department. They the cock of the walk. They thought they were the be-all and end-all, was the internal medicine was the pinnacle. So the biggest group we had were internists.
Why did you go to med school?
Why did I go to med school? I was in Scotland. I went to med school because they told me it was the most difficult thing to get into. I was a bit of an intellectual snob, I suppose. And like all of the lady docs I talked to, it looked tough, it looked interesting. Give it a go.
I recall there were struggles with how to distinguish themselves as from nurses or maintaining femininity. Do they feel pressure to dress more masculine or way feminine? You know, high heels, jewelry, what?
Well, this is one of the themes of the book, that there were no good role models for women physicians. There were two caricatures held up. There was what's called the hen medic. It was one tough broad. You know, you get the picture. And there was what they called the dilettante lady physician. And this caricature goes way back to the 1890s in the literature. I had to read a lot of literature for this. And the dilettante lady physician stayed in her lane, but she was very cute and sweet and came to medical meetings and to the delight of everyone. And I think we all fell into this. If you're being very feminine, are you lightweight and silly and yeah. And if you speak up and get aggressive, you're too butch. And there's also in the literature, when they're interviewing really distinguished women doctors who became deans and things, they said if they started, asserting themselves, someone said, "Oh, you're one of them radical feminists," which was a negative image, a sort of very negative image, and that kind of made them stop. So there's a lovely phrase from a book, an article by Sue Pangleton that says, "a carefully modulated femininity." So if you look, they're usually nicely dressed, but not flashy, and carefully modulated femininity. A little charm, a little firm. Sometimes your mother, and sometimes your dad. It's an unanswerable question. Each lady found her own way.
I'm curious, did you make any attempt to interview female doctors from all over the country, or were you sticking to perhaps bigger cities where there maybe are more opportunities for women?
I was faced with finding a group of women to talk about, and we used the convenient sample of asking the Alumni Association of KU to give us volunteers. So our ladies are all KU alumni, and they were started from 1948 to 1975. But they spent their lives all over. Some in rural Appalachia, great big research institutes, world famous places. Some did overseas, some did missionary, small towns, large towns, all over the place. So they lived their lives in multiple diverse environments, but they were all KU graduates. Let me ask you a question. Have any of you ever heard of the book called The Boys in White? Yeah. You're not. What do you think of it? The Boys in White was a required reading in our medical sociology class in 1968. It's a terrible book. So what they did was they wanted to talk about how medical students are changed from bright young things to cynical doctors. And they embedded sociologists with KU medical students in 1958. And it's totally unethical. These sociology researchers just follow the students around everywhere and interrupt their conversations and just literally bug them. And then they wrote this book. And it's called The Boys in White. And reading it in Scotland for the sociology exam, we couldn't understand a word of it. They seemed very uptight, very miserable. So it says in the beginning, At the interview, every year they're interviewed, and the examiners say, will this bright boy really make a medical man? For medicine is man's work. They then totally ignore women for the whole of the book. It's all about man's work. One of the ladies I interviewed was in the class of 1958, and she said, do you know that damn book? Or words, similar words. And I said, yeah, I had to study it in med school. She said, you're the only person I ever know who read that. It's terrible, it's a complete caricature. I want my revenge on that book. So the subtitle of this book is The Girls in White. And she was wonderful. She was the class of 58, and she was 88 when I interviewed her, and she's still working, still seeing patients. And I said, are you going to... And I called her a couple of weeks ago when the book came out, and I told her about it, and I said, did you ever stop practice? She said, well, no, my husband made me promise to stop when I reached 90, but he died. Sorry. I hope it's the kind of book that while you're reading it, you keep jigging the person next to you and say, I do have to tell you that there are two people who really worked on this with me, because we interviewed everyone, and then we had these recordings, and we had transcripts. The ladies read the transcripts and said, no, you got that wrong, you got that right. And then 3 people studied it all, so that it's not just my perspective and my biases. We had a PhD person who knew what she was doing, and then we had a senior medical student who had finished all her rotations and needed something to do. And I kept getting emails from this senior medical student that started, OMG! Because we kept trying to be objective and have the truth. So I hope you enjoy the stories. There are just thousands of stories in there. Wonderful ladies. The best thing from the whole book was that I had a letter or an email from a daughter of the old lady who was in the nursing home in Appalachia. And she said, since you got Mom into the book, she started telling us about things she'd never told us before. So that was kind of sweet.
I've got a question. My granddaughter's in med school now. And you talked about a medical student reviewing the book. Did she make any comments during your writing of it or during the reading of it that implied things were different? Or if she'd encountered some of the same things?
It's so different. We kept having to explain to her just what medical students had to do in those days about having to take the bloods and move the patients and the physical work and being pinned. But she kept saying, why did you not object? Why did you not complain? Why did you not sue them? And Connie, why did we not sue them? If a medical student made trouble in those days, they left medicine. We probably should have complained or stuck up more, but most of the ladies I talked to felt it was better to navigate, and they were too busy. Just the pace of trying to keep it all together. If there was something they wanted to complain about, it was just hard to organize and get together. And this is at a time of student riots, race riots, all kind of activism. So if you stuck your head up above the parapet, you know, you need a letter for the next job, you need a recommendation for the next job. Maybe we were cowards, maybe we were pragmatists, but different generations. So the med student had a hard time with this. That's not fair. No. You did what? And someone asked about nurses. We had a sort of, they were constantly being taken for nurses, but they didn't want to object to that because they were totally dependent on the nurses to save their lives on the floor. So most of them tried to be very, very nice to nurses and treat them well and hope to be well treated in return. Some comments about the nurses treated us terribly, they just wanted to date the guys and we were competition. Some comments about the nurses saved my life, they were the best people in the world and I'm still friends with them. So it was all over the map. But there was another sort of decision point when you're taken for a nurse. How do you handle that without insulting the nurses or keep your dignity? Just the whole thing is about navigating an alien environment because you have this single, I want to be a physician, I want to spend my life being with people when they're in trouble. And they said some wonderfully moving things about their relationships with patients. And that's what it's all about.
Did you meet your husband in that school?
It's an irrelevant question. I did meet my husband in school, but I'll tell you, one of the other ladies, when you get to med school, there's this awful thing of anatomy dissection in those days. There's 6 of you around the body, and you sink or swim together. And she hadn't done anatomy in college, and she was very nervous, and she was really frightened. And the guys seemed very confident, and she hadn't gone to KU, and they'd all gone to KU, and they all knew one another. And she was really, really upset at the end of the first day, and all these beautiful drawings were being done by the guys, and they were naming things. And she was really upset, so she saw the guy who she thought knew the most and was really leading the group, and she went up to him and asked if he would mind helping her. And she married him. So she said, we met over a body. And they're still married.
I hope you enjoyed it.